Alexis Heflin, and I teach Latin classes from the beginning levels, mostly middle school students, Latin 1A, all the way through Latin 4-5, our upper levels. And I also teach mythology and classical civilization courses, as well as ancient history courses for our middle school students who are just getting into online learning for the first time. Yes, I am all things classical and ancient. I love studying about the ancient world and I love language, and that's where those two things come together really nicely. One thing a lot of our students find that they learn a lot about language in general, about the English language that they speak, about other languages that they may be studying, especially the ones that come directly from Latin, French, and Spanish, and Italian. So even though they're not using those skills to actively communicate with people in Latin, what they learn in Latin, there's a lot of higher order thinking involved in analyzing and translating Latin. So they develop those skills, and they just learn a lot about English and grammar in general by taking Latin. So in Latin 1 through 3, our live classes are used for me to explain the grammar concepts, and then students to get some practice working with the language by doing various activities, sometimes translation, sometimes practicing conjugating verbs, sometimes manipulating words in the sentences. So it's grammatical instruction and live interaction working with the language. Even though Latin is not an actively living spoken language like other languages like French or Spanish or German, we still do a fair amount of, we work on our communication skills in Latin. We learn how to use more modern expressions in Latin. We have conversations with each other. So we talk about the weather, talk about what we're wearing, talk about what we're doing this weekend. We do learn how to do that in Latin. And that's actually a part of the class that students enjoy a lot. One aspect of our class that students may not be used to in other classes is that they are required to do corrections to their homework assignment as part of receiving credit for that assignment. And that's because it's really important in language study to make mistakes. I tell them it's okay to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. And so by doing the corrections, they're working actively with those mistakes, understanding why they made those mistakes and correcting them. So that is a part of their homework assignment that is designed to help them learn. By the time students get to Latin 4 or 5, we've learned the basic grammar that they need to read real authentic Latin literature. And that's what we're doing for the whole year in both Latin 4 and 5. We read the authentic, unadapted works of Virgil, Caesar, Catullus, Ovid. And so students prepare small amounts of those lines of the text. They look at the grammar forms, they find rhetorical devices, and they make sure they know all the vocabulary, and they prepare those for our class meetings. And then we go over those in class. Everyone shares their lines. And then we talk about not just the translation, but what that tells us, what the poet or the writer is trying to tell us about ancient Roman culture, about ancient Roman life. What we try and get at in all of our classes is, what does it mean to be an ancient Greek or Roman? And I think the best way to learn that is to read about it in their own words. So our goal is ultimately to read the authentic, unadapted literature and learn about the ancient world that way. Latin Club is a great opportunity for students to continue learning about the ancient world in a very low pressure environment. We don't have assignments or tests or quizzes, and that's where we talk about history and culture, things that we don't necessarily have time to cover in the language class. They have a lot of, we have a lot of flexibility in what we study. This year, the students were really interested in learning about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD and the effects on the city of Pompeii. And so we actually took 2 weeks of our Latin Club meetings to learn about that. We also like to play a lot of games that I don't necessarily have a lot of time to do in class. So sometimes we do those things in Latin Club. We also prepare for the National Latin Exam contest, like the National Mythology exam, the National Classical Civilization exam. So those are all optional things that our Latin students can take advantage of. They do not have to take Latin with me. We usually have a good quarter of our Latin Club are students that take Latin outside of WTMA. So it's actually really fun to have students join us from different backgrounds. It's a good way for students to make friends outside of their WTMA classes with people that share the same interests with them. I like middle schoolers because they're very curious. They can be very fun, silly, and goofy. They have great ideas to share, and it's fun to see them learning about the world, learning about things for the first time. I teach Story of Ancient Times, which is based off of the Story of the World series, the first one. But we actually do a lot more. We use a lot more than that text. Our readings are based in the Story of the World text, but our live classes expand upon those readings. We delve into some more in-depth topics that aren't covered there. And students do a lot of different types of assignments in that class. They have one assignment a week. It might be an assignment where they label important places on a map. They might do a writing assignment where they answer a question based on a comparison of primary sources. They might do a creative project where they actually build something, like, for example, building a very small segment of the Great Wall of China was a recent one, or building an aqueduct, or maybe hosting an ancient Olympic Games with your family. So we like to have some fun creative projects in there. So there's a great variety in what they're asked to do. The live classes are mostly lecture based, but students do have the opportunity to share ideas, to engage, to ask questions, even though those classes are primarily lecture based. History class, the assignments are, they have one assignment a week in addition to a reading Story of the World. And those assignments can be different. There could be a quiz or a test as your weekly assignment. So some weeks you might have a writing assignment. Some weeks you might have a map assignment, a creative assignment, a quiz, or a test. But every week you have one thing to do and a chapter or two in the book to read. So here is what a typical Latin 1 class would look like. Today's reading that we're going to be doing in class is a Roman play, so we might start by looking at pictures of an ancient Roman theater. This picture on the left is a fresco showing some actors, so we can get excited for the day's reading by talking about drama in the ancient world. We do like to talk a lot about the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as the language. Then we'll talk about the day's objectives, what students are going to learn how to do today, what they'll be able to do by the end of class. So today they're going to review what we learned last time, identifying the conjugation group of verbs, and they'll learn how to conjugate verbs in 2 of those groups. They'll also learn the chapter's vocabulary words, and they'll have the opportunity to speak in Latin. Then I usually tell them exactly what we're going to do. I lay out the plan for the day so they know all the different activities we're going to be doing. So we'll do a little bit of a review. We'll review the story that we've been reading. Then we talk about the new grammatical topic and put it in our notes. And we'll talk about the conjugation of verbs and put that in our notes as well. Do some exercises to practice it and finish up by using Latin in a little bit more of a modern context by conversing with one another. So the first thing we would do is we would review the previous class's material. A lot of what we learn in Latin builds on what we've learned previously, so it's important to review all the time. Then we would listen to the reading. Every chapter in our book has a reading that's adapted from ancient Roman literature. So we get exposure to poetry, to letters, to drama. All of it is based on the work of real Roman authors. So they're getting experience reading about the ancient Romans in their own words, almost from the very beginning. So this is a play. Students listen to the story. They listen to a recording of the story to hear how the language would be pronounced. They have the opportunity to read it, even to act out the roles of the different characters. So they would read it, and I would ask them if they noticed anything about any of the verbs. In their chapter, there's a reading vocabulary that gives them words in the story that we haven't learned yet, unfamiliar terms. And so I'd ask them what they notice that's different about this story. And usually students would notice that verbs like see, video means see, and vides means see, have different endings. And usually by the time we get to the end of the story, they will figure out that the different endings on the verbs show the different people who are doing the action. So video means I see, and vides means you see. So what they're going to learn how to do in this class is to change the endings of verbs to show that different people are doing the action. I see, you see. That's called conjugating a verb, and that's the skill that we're going to be working on. So they would read the whole story, and then after they've come to conclusions about the endings changing on verbs by themselves from reading the story, then we would actually talk about that grammatical topic, about tense. We're learning to conjugate verbs in the present tense. And so the first thing that I do is simply explain the steps for conjugating a verb in the present tense. And so students have, in Latin 1, they keep it all the way through Latin 4-5. They have a grammar notes packet. Every time we learn a new grammatical concept, they write the information about that in their grammar notes packet. So it's very exciting for them to see that packet, the information, and they're growing as their Latin study goes through the 4 years, even 5 years of study. And so I always tell them exactly where to put that material in their grammar packet. And I also keep those notes on Blackboard. So if a student misses anything, if they would like to just pay attention to the lesson and then copy the notes from that packet later, they can do that because some students prefer to listen and absorb rather than writing. So I explain how to conjugate a present tense verb. So you're given two principal parts when you're conjugating a verb. And they would look like this. Here's a verb that means love, amo, amare. So the first part that you get means I love. That's the first person singular. So you already have one of the verb forms that you need right there. Then you take off the RE from the second principal part. I like to call that doing RE surgery. You take off the RE, and what you have left is what's called the stem, or the present stem. Now, I asked them at this point to leave something in their notes blank because we're only learning about a small section of verbs. I like to introduce these topics, not all at once, but in bits and pieces so that they can get used to the different ideas. So I asked them to leave the next part blank for when we learn different conjugations, different groups of verbs. Then, what we add to that stem are what are called personal endings to show that you are doing something. He or she or it is doing something. We are doing something. You all are doing something. They are doing something. So here are those endings. In Latin, if a verb ends in S, it means that you are doing something, one you. If it ends in a T, it means a he or a she or an it is doing something. How do you know whether it's he, she, or it? Usually the context of your story will help you figure that out. You'll have been reading about someone in the story, and that's the person who's doing the action. A mus means we are doing something. A tis means you all are doing something, more than one you. And an nt means they are doing something. And so we're going to learn a little bit more later on down the road about some other types of verbs. So I instruct students to leave this blank because we're going to talk about some more later. I try and keep it simple for beginning to learn about the topic. And so then once you've added all those endings, what you've done is conjugated the verb. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So what that means then, once you've conjugated a verb in the present tense, it means that it's happening right now. Present tense means right now. So you can translate it a couple different ways. So amo means I love, very simple. You can also translate it as a present progressive form. I am loving, he is loving, you are loving. And then you can also translate that I do love. So all three of those are ways to translate the present tense in Latin. So in English, we say those ideas using different words, but in Latin, amo would cover all three of those. So you can often pick the one that sounds the best in the context of what you're reading. So let's see what that would look like. First of all, if I were teaching this in class, I would do an example of a verb to conjugate, and then I would ask students to write on the whiteboard, and they would practice doing it. Sometimes students like to participate more by writing on the board, writing in the chat, going on the mic, so I like to provide them with opportunities to communicate in all those ways during class. So in our Latin classes, in each class, every student has an assigned color that they write on the whiteboard in, and so that's the way that they can show me that they're participating, that they're engaging with the language when they're writing on the board. So here, I'm going to follow those steps that I just showed you. So let's take that verb again, amo, amare, which means to love. So the first thing I do, I always get 1 out of 6 correct if I remember that amo is the first person singular. That's all there is to it. It means I love. So I'm going to put amo right in this box, and it means I love. So I already have 1 out of 6 correct. If you know that, you've got 1 already done for you. Then I do my RE surgery. So I'm going to take off my RE, and I'm left with the stem. That's ama. And those endings that I showed you on the previous slide, that's what we put on the end. So our endings are s, t, mus, tis, und. So those endings are very important as we learn different tenses in Latin. All the tenses that we use are going to use those endings just with different markers in front of them. So learning these basic endings is very, very important for our Latin study. So like I said, take off the RE. Then you would just add the endings. Amas, which means you love. Amat, he, she, or it loves. In the plural, talking about more than one person, amamus, we love. Amatis, you all love. And then finally, amant, they love. So I've conjugated that verb in the present tense. I've given every form I could possibly need to say for anyone doing that action. If you have, for example, a person's name, or maybe a type of person like the boy, then you would use this form. You would say puer means boy, amat. So if the person you're talking about is a he or a she or an it, you would use the T. If you wanted to say the men love or the women love, you would use this form. So the ending in Latin tells you who's doing the action. It's very different from English. English uses a pronoun or a noun to show who's doing the action of a verb, like we. But in Latin, you look at the ending. It's all one word. So you actually don't need a separate word for we to say we love. The verb contains the subject and the verb all in one. So to find out who's doing the action of a Latin verb, you look at the end. O means I, S means you, T means he, she, or it, mus means we, tis means you all, and nt means they. So now what I would do in a live class is I would clear everything off from the board and give the students an opportunity to practice doing that. Now I would write a couple of reminders on the board to help them with that. So my first reminder, a little helpful hint for present tense, is I would say 1 out of 6. That reminds them that the first word that I give them is always the first person singular, and it always goes right here in this box. And then you're done. Then I would remind them to do their RE surgery to get the stem. And then I would remind them to add the new endings that we just learned. So at this point, I would tell all the students to write in their assigned colors on the whiteboard to conjugate that verb. I would give them a verb, for example, how about dokeo dokere, I teach. And so I'd give them a new verb and they would fill in the whiteboard. It would be a lovely rainbow of verbs. Everyone contributes their own verb form to the whiteboard. So it gets filled up. It looks very pretty. And so that's one way that they can practice. So they've learned how to conjugate verbs. Then we would do another activity where it's looking at it from the other direction. So in this activity, they're creating the verbs, they're writing the verb forms. In this activity, they would get the Latin verb forms and do it the other way around. Tell me what it means in English. What would you say if you saw these verbs in a story? So I would tell them to look at the ending first. And sometimes we might need a little reminder about our endings. So I'd write OST, mus, tis, und. As we get further into our study, I can take those little reminders away because they start to remember these endings a little bit more. So I say to look on the end of the verb first. So S, we learned, S means you. So our subject of our verb is you. Woko means call. We get things like vocal or vocabulary or vocation or evoke from that. So the ending tells us who's doing the action. The front part tells us what they're doing. You call. It's as simple as that. You could also say you are calling or you do call, whatever makes the most sense in the context of the story you're reading or the sentence you're translating. So here's another one. This verb ends in a T. And so our T ending was the one that meant he or she or it. So wide means to see. So we could say either he or she or it sees. We get the word video from that, or visual comes from that as well. We like to talk about, whenever we use vocabulary, we like to talk about the English derivatives that come from that word. A big part of our Latin study is being able to recognize Latin roots in English words. So we have to be careful with number 3 right here. This verb ends in a T, but if we look closely at our endings, we see that we have an ending that's NT. So it's very important to make sure that we're looking at the whole ending and not just one letter. NT is the ending that means they. Expecto kind of looks like the word expect in English, and that's actually what it means. It can also mean to look out for or to wait for or await. So sometimes our words can have different ways that we can translate them in English, and we have to think about what sounds the best in the context of the story that we're reading. So I'm going to say they await. So I would do a couple of these as examples, and then I would allow students to take a try at them themselves, to choose one of these and to write the answers on the board. They could also put it in the chat, or they could speak it on the mic if they like doing that. So that would be another way to practice this vocabulary. So we like to go back and forth from English to Latin, Latin to English. We do composition in both directions, composition and translation. It's important to practice the language by listening to it, writing it, reading it, and speaking. And we have the opportunity to do all 4 of those things in class. So even though Latin is not a living spoken language, you're not ever going to get off a plane anywhere and need to speak Latin to communicate, we still like to have a little bit of fun with speaking Latin. We do work on our communicative skills. So every chapter we'll learn how to say something that maybe modern people would say in Latin, or something that you might use in a conversation with your classmates. And so this example, we have a quaestio, which means a question. And here's a couple of ways to say, what's your name in Latin? There's 3 different ways to say it. They all work just fine. You could say, quo modo te vocant. That literally means, how do they call you? You could say, quid nomen tibi est. What is your name? Or if you want to be really fancy, you could say, quo nomine appellaris. By what name are you called? And we have an answer for each of those. Me vocant. They call me. And then you would fill in your name. Nomen mihi est, or the really fun one, appellor. I am called whatever your name is. Here's another question that students can ask each other. Quias es, or unde es orta. These both mean, where do you come from? And the answer would be ortus or orta. This is the masculine form. This is the feminine form. It means I come from. And if you want to say what city you come from, you could say ortus or orta sum ex urbe and put the name of your city. So students have a lot of fun using these phrases to converse with each other. And often, before class even starts, they'll be having little conversations with each other in Latin. And so they also have information about Roman cultural topics in their book. For example, what Romans used by way of names. So sometimes we can relate the conversations to Roman culture. So that's a fun way that we typically end our class. And then at the very end, ad finem orae, we always have a few minutes for questions on homework, questions on anything that we've learned. And then we wrap up by talking about what the ludus domesticus is, the homework, what students need to do to be prepared for the next class. So studying vocabulary is very, very important. I emphasize consistent, regular vocabulary study, because that's the key to success. Sometimes, even if you're not sure how the grammar works, knowing the vocabulary and using your common sense and contextual clues will help you to figure things out. So I do emphasize regular vocabulary study. And in our Blackboard course, there are a couple of different ways that students can study vocabulary. I have Quizlets. I have a game called Gimkit that students really like to play. So there's a lot of different ways that students can study their vocabulary, and they can find what works for them. I also direct students to the sections in our textbook that talk about the grammar that we learned that day, so they can reread it as a way of reinforcing, refreshing that. I often say maybe you can teach it to somebody in your house. So this is looking at the same thing that we talked about in class, just expressed in a different way. And then finally, I assign a number of exercises in our workbook for students to practice what we've done that day. So these particular exercises would have students practice conjugating verbs. An important part of our homework assignment is to correct our work. Students need to do corrections on their homework assignment in order to get full credit for the assignment. They're also allowed to do corrections on their quizzes if they miss something on their quizzes, because learning from mistakes is a very important part of the learning process. It helps us learn when we actively look for what we've done wrong and we try to find the correct answer. So doing our corrections is a very, very important part of our work. And that's where we would end our class after having our conversations with each other. So that's what a typical Latin class looks like at WTMA.